Our next speaker would be Dr. Christopher Scott. Dr. Christopher Scott is a research professor of water resource policy at the Udall Center for Studies in Public Policy and a professor at the School of Geography and Development, University of Arizona. An interdisciplinary scholar, Dr. Scott's research has focused on policy dimensions of global change with particular emphasis on water security and energy security, climate adaptation, urban wastewater, and agriculture-urban water use transfers. Transboundary water resources. He is founding co-director of Aquasec, Center for Excellence for Water Security, and director of the Consortium for the Arizona-Mexico Arid Environments, SASMAX. Please.
Thank you very much for the kind introduction. I'm going to give two brief embellishments on my CV that I think will be useful as I give my remarks. One, I was doing voluntary work in rural Rajasthan in the drought of 1987. I was in a tribal district of southern part of Udaipur district with an NGO called Seva Mandir. And that was exactly corresponding to the blip in the map that Manu showed, the timeline, which was the water abundant period with a little dip below, and then it came back before groundwater levels crashed in the 1990s. The other piece that I'd like to say is that from 2001 to 2005, I was the regional director for the International Water Management Institute, IMI, based out of Colombo, Sri Lanka, although I set up the office that we had in Hyderabad with ICRISAT, so will provide some results or some findings and observations based on some of our work with watershed programs. Now, I think what I'm going to be presenting here actually is very consonant with the remarks that we've had from the last two speakers. What I'd like to do, instead of taking you on a data-driven empirical type of an exercise, I'd like to actually undertake a thought experiment with you. So bear with me. There's a question mark at the end of my title, and there's a question mark at the end of my entire talk, because I think this is all still speculative, but I think it does very well get borne out by much of the empirical work that was presented by the last two speakers. Additionally, what I'd like to say is I will present at the end a number of the citations for the findings of our work that support many of these contentions that I'm putting up. So it's not that they're just out there based on a thought exercise, but much of it is actually based on research. The other piece that perhaps is important is that I've undertaken water security work of this kind, as was kindly introduced, in Mexico and in arid regions of South America. So that's Chile, Argentina, Brazil, and Peru, and in the dry regions of those countries. So what is human security? Let me at least just set the stage conceptually for what I'd like to be talking about. Human security really came out of the post-World War II understanding, where a strong national security, defense security, intelligence security view had been taken. And many people were questioning this and actually putting forward new understandings of the human condition, well-being, the Human Development Index, HDI, and so forth. So it really comes from that sort of side of it. Food security, including with some of the famine situations and food supply, food safety questions that were discussed by several of the last speakers, really I think is much better well understood. So around questions of food production, but actually food sovereignty, control over food systems, and also then implications that are there for sort of the dietary, human health, public health kinds of questions. But what is water security? And actually, how do we understand that? So what does that mean? What is water security when we take a human security perspective? Is it quantity? Is it access to quantity? Is it quality? Is it the differential impacts of poor quality water? What is and how do we understand water security? There's been actually a lot of work, and I'll present something that Manu and I are working on together. But I've actually proposed this, along with some colleagues, this particular definition of it that we came out with a couple of years ago. And I only wanted to put that up because I think it brings forward a theme that we've been talking across, including the biodiversity conservation forest and now this water session, about these topics of resilience and the ability of social and ecological systems, human societies, and this policy framework to actually strengthen resilience. So this is the approach that we've particularly taken. Now, water security. So Manu is the chief editor and asked a number of us to participate in a new journal. So for those of you interested in bringing forward your great research around water and these different kinds of topics we're talking about, we have a new journal called Water Security, and I'm focusing more on the institutions and governance parts of that particular journal, but we're bringing some of that out. So stay tuned for that. So here's some new understandings of actually the linkage around water and food, and together with energy. And I very much concur with Manu on the question of the nexus, with one important difference. It didn't actually get started with the World Economic Forum in 2008. They got on the bandwagon. Actually, it started in India. The nexus is a uniquely Indian concept and innovation. I'll show where that's come from. And I think that the challenges that we're talking about today, again, from that human security perspective, with biodiversity, with forests, with water and livelihoods and so forth, really comes back to this sort of nexus understanding. Of course, there's the resource nexus at the very basic level, how much water is required for how much food and how much energy do we generate from how much water and so forth. There's also then the institutional part, who manages those different sectors and those resources to allow us to pursue security or be in situations of insecurity. And then I think sort of at that ultimate plane is the goal and the objective that we're looking at. And I've done some work with some of my graduate students to basically show there's a normative goal, it's an end goal, and ultimately it's elusive because the human condition is never perfected, and security is always something that we are searching for. We may be better in reaching it in some contexts and less the others. So to think through with you just where did some of this nexus come from? The very clear understanding of green revolution, the background, how it emerged, what were the driving forces and so forth, now is increasingly being questioned. And in fact, we've realized that there are no more externalities. And the human impacts of it, as well as the environmental degradation associated with the green revolution in agriculture, is actually part and parcel of the same package. So you can't say that increasing yield is the benefit of the green revolution, but the other things are just sort of the externalities. There are no more externalities. And actually, I think that's something that the Planetary Boundaries paper and much of our discussion here, whether we agree with this or that particular definition of the boundary, it is one Earth system. And we're not likely to find another one very soon. So I do actually think we have to think about the internalization of a lot of these kinds of unintended consequences. Going forward, to really understand this nexus focused particularly on groundwater irrigation, we've heard that story again in the Arkavati case that Veena just presented, in the US case with looking at different changes in cropping mix, and the India case. So if we actually go back, Girish Sant and Dikshit in 1996 really brought forward this idea of the nexus. They have papers entitled Nexus related to groundwater pumping and irrigation. It actually, and I did an etymological search for where nexus terminology came from, and around resources, actually the United Nations University in 1982 actually had some interesting work going on in Brazil and in India around this nexus idea. So I actually say that the nexus comes from 1982 and then strengthened in the 90s, including with drought situations and so forth, around this concept of the groundwater pumping irrigation nexus that I'll talk a little bit more about today in India, and continuing in many different guises. Questions about the economics of the nexus. There actually was a project called WENEXA, Water Energy Nexus, just outside of Bangalore, which was actually the last time I was in Bangalore in 2003. So it's very nice to be back. Not quite 20 years, but I'll present some remarks that my association with ATREE has been almost 20 years. But actually some work on this nexus concept here in Karnataka. We've done some comparative work across different contexts around nexus ideas, both in India and Mexico. And nexus now, to expand it a bit more and just to show where some of our work is going, and particularly focusing in the Ganga Basin around hydropower development and irrigation trade-offs around food, energy, and water in that context. And also where we talk about wastewater and wastewater treatment and the energy requirements for that, and particularly under conditions of chronic power failure. And then talk about the quality of water that is treated in that is released out of effluent from wastewater treatment plants, which most cases in our context goes downstream and into the tanks, which gets used for irrigation. So there's also a nexus dimension there. I won't be talking any more about those in this particular thing. So basically, let's talk about irrigation today. This is the thought exercise that I'd like you to join me on. Irrigation around the world is the world's largest user of water. It will likely remain so for some time to come. The world's largest irrigators by area, by volume, by surface, by groundwater, any measure you have of it. India is the largest, China is the second, US is the third, and following from that, some additional countries. Why this is important is, I think, the same storyline that Manu told us, is that it's interesting to trace the background and then project into the future how we understand this. So these increasing trends in groundwater irrigation are rampant all around the world. Depletion of groundwater is taking place. There are other practices that are intentioned or designed to augment water supplies, known as interbasin transfers, or in India, AKA, also known as interlinking of rivers. And I'll come back a little bit to that, because there's a strong rationale behind the interlinking project, if you will, that is driven by this irrigation and food supply logic. So does irrigation-based food security hold water security hostage? This is my basic question. Parenthetically, I used to have the title of a talk that was in a different sense of does energy security, and I used to use the word trump. Does it trump? So when you play cards, you trump something. So now Trump has a whole different meaning. So I've changed the words to jeopardize, to hold hostage. But it's the same idea. Which imperative drives which particular piece of it, right? So India's current food security today is based on rice and wheat. There's a whole story behind that, Green Revolution, Food Corporation of India, food procurement, minimum support price, exactly the same storyline that Manu has told you with public distribution system. I think there was also a very important talk yesterday, and I don't know if Narasimha Rao is here today. He mentioned that he might have to go out. But basically this whole idea of what are the dietary implications of taking a set of diets which were integrated based on local production and so forth, and including if the carbohydrate content of your diet was based on not rice and wheat. There's some very strong inclinations to show how humans have adapted, including dietarily and with the human genome, to certain food types and so forth. And it's not an easy switch to go from being a millet eater into becoming a rice eater. There's lots of issues and challenges associated with that. I'm not the nutritionist, but believe me, there are public health challenges associated with this. Going on to a very heavy carbohydrates-based diet, for instance, diabetes, other kinds of issues that we have. The whole hidden hunger question that we talked about, by saying food security will be met by providing so many kilocalories a day per person, doesn't address the whole human security, nutrition kind of aspect. So this food security imperative really has come out. How will India continue to feed its 1.2 and growing billion and growing population? So we have to understand now some of this from the institutional and the political side as well, is that farmers form an important vote bank. And this whole vote bank politics associated with rural support programs and so forth is a large way and rationale for the background to the energy subsidies and even free energy provided in many of the different states. There is also, and I think Veena has told the story about the Central Groundwater Board and the Central Water Commission. Those are central agencies, but actually state irrigation departments have held pride of place in many of the years throughout the whole history. There's a whole set of questions associated with why irrigation departments are so powerful. In many cases, they control the water, obviously, but they also control the infrastructure, the dams, the canals, and so forth. And I'll come back to that a little bit when talking about the interlinking of rivers. Now, the implications of this for the ongoing shift to groundwater is that the water and groundwater domination of the food security for India and the energy piece of it is that has actually contributed very significantly to the power crisis that the entire country faces. So you remember that in 2012 and 2014, the northern grid and eastern grids tripped. There was actually a piece of that story that was actually behind that was the agricultural capture of energy. And now what are the implications of that for a whole set of other sectors, industry and cities and so forth. Groundwater pumping itself, because of the fossil fuel base of the electricity supply, has a huge carbon emissions implication. There were estimates even that something like 40%, this is before the recent round of industrialization, so the numbers would go down, but that 40% of India's carbon emissions were attributable to groundwater pumping because of the massive energy that goes into pumping 250 cubic kilometers of water per year, which is far higher than any other country. It's higher than China and higher than the United States. The state electricity boards are in bankruptcy. We all know that. There's massive cross-subsidies that are required to keep the SEBs afloat. And there's a groundwater pumping story that's behind that as well. And drinking water supply in rural districts particularly is also imperiled because that's the very same water that rural communities are drinking. So what are some of these alternative pathways forward? One is to actually look at taking food production to water. And sorry, Manu, I didn't see your slides before, and I know he didn't see mine. You may have thought we fixed our slides together so that we were actually telling, the same story, but it's nice to see that, the important part is don't take food production, don't take water to food production, take food production to water, okay? And so we were told that the water crisis is over. All we have to do is wait for the interlinking of rivers program. The situation will be solved for the entire country. And then, of course, you have, a more critical, humorous take such as this, that finally with the pipes and pumps and canals and everything will be joined up, but is the water there, and particularly for the types of uses that we have. So don't keep pushing water to food production, push food production to water. That's one message I'd like to leave you with. Next, treat groundwater as a strategic resource. It is actually something that we have to look at because of its long-term value, its relatively high quality in comparison to surface water, and its location from place to place, not only in the main the reservoirs that are located in one place or the other, but it's underneath our feet all around the country, even in the hard rock regions of the Deccan Plateau and so forth. So groundwater should be used to complement, not substitute, surface water. The long-term multi-annual water storage needs to be thought about. Actually, let's store water, but not in dams. Let's store it underground. And there's a lot of creative thinking that's been done on managed aquifer recharges, the physical side of it, but also the institutional side of the banking, the storage, the credits, the exchange, the mechanisms, the regulation to ensure that groundwater can be a strategic resource. And ultimately, we have to wean the farmers and the country's food security off of and full irrigation. We're not going to do away with irrigation. I'm not advocating that for him. But I think the irrigation has to play its proper role in the broader set of contexts. So for food security, we need to actually be going back to rain-fed, bajra, jawar, ragi, etc. Many different crops would also come underneath that. Irrigation can be there, but done in a supplemental fashion for when rain-fed crops might require a strategic irrigation. Let's look more creatively, and this is something that I've learned over the last day and a half on the agri-silvopastoral system. So how do we understand the role between crop livestock systems, but with forest and forest access and use and nutrient transfers and so forth, and the whole set of questions that we had in the panel this morning around the watershed movement, and what did that mean for integrated rural-based livelihoods and so forth. Is that one of the opportunities for the way forward? Finally, thinking also of the farm, forest, pasture set of linkages, and that whole question of biodiversity and people, going back to Georgina's talk from this morning. So finally, just two very brief remarks on some of this science policy work. I'm very pleased to see that ATREE has been taking up this use-inspired, policy-relevant research focus. We talked yesterday about the light versus heat models of policy change. That is to say, one is to let's shed light on it, bring findings, and all the decision makers will have the aha moment. Of course, we know that doesn't work entirely. There's the pressure model, the advocacy, and so forth, and that goes along with the light and heat. Now, one of the comments that I think wasn't made was light generates heat, and heat generates light, okay? So that's also something we should think about. Now, this is an iterative process. We need to think through how this is done in an interactive process, but I also think that we need a socialization. We actually need institutional incentives to promote interdisciplinarity, including in university departments, including in science funding bodies, including for the policymakers, so that ATREE as an interdisciplinary microcosm can actually share those kinds of approaches to a broader macrocosm. Now, I actually think this is also a generational shift. So while we're celebrating all the great work that the brilliant students and others are working with, and that's one of the reasons I went back to the university after being with the International Water Management Institute for 10 years, was to get back into the learning culture. I consider myself a student as well, is that I think we have to continue to be understanding the cultural changes, the paradigm shifts around the different generations of how science will actually be pursued in the future, including within the academy and with the official funding sources. So again, some work I've done, and I'll close with this. Time is up right now. But instead of the conventional linear model of science, identification, problem, resolution, recommendations, and adoption, which never works, that top model just simply doesn't work that way, let's understand an iterative loop model, because it gets refined on each pass. And the other thing that's added there is civil society. So we need not only researchers and public sector government servants and government agencies, but we also need civil society, NGOs, the private sector, and so forth, to be a formal part of that as well. Thank you very much to ATREE for 18 years of association, going back to when I was associated with SciSed, and I know ISEC is separate, but SciSed and ISEC, and I always had a fond place in my heart for Bangalore when I was in Rajasthan and Delhi and Uttarakhand and Hyderabad and so forth. I also very briefly wanted to thank IMI, my previous employer, the work I do currently under the Inter-American Institute for Global Change Research, U.S. National Science Foundation, Lloyd's Register Foundation, and others. And I'd like to leave you briefly with the website address in case any of you are interested. In the circle there, each one of these is a hyperlink to a dozen or 2 dozen studies that we've done on each one of those topics, and that's the basis for the policy journey that I've wanted you to join me with today. So thank you very much.